3 weeks ago, I watched a video with 2.1 million views that made one very specific promise. Pour a $2 liquid into your gas tank, drive for 20 minutes, and your oxygen sensor clog disappears forever. No more checking engine light, no more $300 shop bills. I read the comments. Thousands of people had already tried it. Some of them swore it worked. Some of them said their check engine light came back within a week. A few of them, and this is the part that made me actually start digging, said their car ran worse afterward than it did before they touched it. So I spent the last 3 weeks doing what that video didn't do. I pulled the actual engineering data on how these sensors are built. I talked to people who work on exhaust systems for a living. I looked at what the companies who actually manufacture automotive cleaning chemicals say about this exact method on the record, in writing. And what I found is not the story either side wants you to hear. It's not a miracle fix, and it's not a total scam either. It's something more useful than both of those, and it's going to save some of you real money tonight. And it's going to stop some of you from ruining a sensor that was actually fine to begin with. Here's why I actually care enough to spend 3 weeks on a 15-second trend instead of just moving on to the next video. I heard from an independent shop owner named Marcus who runs a 2-bay garage outside Columbus, and he told me something that stuck with me. He said he started seeing sensors come across his bench that customers pulled out themselves, tried to clean, and then handed to him already ruined, asking him to just put in a new one anyway. Except now they'd also damaged the housing or stripped the threads trying to get it back out a second time. His exact words to me were that the videos cost his customers more than the shops ever did. That's the sentence that made me stop scrolling and start actually researching this properly instead of just reacting to it. Let's start with what this little sensor is actually doing every single second your engine is running, because almost nobody who's sharing that $2 liquid trick actually understands the part they're pouring chemicals at. Your oxygen sensor sits directly in your exhaust stream, usually screwed into the pipe like a spark plug, and at its tip is a small ceramic element made from zirconium dioxide. That ceramic element is the entire sensor. It's not a filter. It's not a screen. It's not something with pores that get physically plugged the way a fuel filter clogs. It's a chemical cell that compares the oxygen level inside your exhaust to the oxygen level in the outside air, and it converts that difference into a tiny voltage signal, usually swinging between about 1/10 of a volt and 9/10 of a volt, dozens of times every second. Your engine computer reads that signal and uses it to adjust exactly how much fuel to inject on every single combustion cycle. When that signal gets sluggish or stops swinging properly, your engine computer is essentially flying blind on the fuel mixture, and that's when you start burning more gas, running rough, and eventually watching that check engine light turn on. Here's where the actual problem starts, and here's where the $2 liquid trick gets its foothold. Over tens of thousands of miles, that ceramic element can get coated. Carbon soot from a rich fuel mixture, trace oil that sneaks past worn valve seals or piston rings, silicone compounds from a gasket sealant that was applied a little too generously somewhere upstream, antifreeze that's leaking into a cylinder through a failing head gasket. All of it eventually ends up in your exhaust stream, and a percentage of it settles onto that ceramic tip. When that coating builds up enough, the sensor can't breathe properly anymore. Its response gets slow, its voltage swing gets narrow. And your engine computer sees that and throws a code, most commonly something like P0130 or P0135 on the sensor itself, or P0171 and P0174 if the fuel trims are drifting because of it. Now here's the part that made this whole $2 liquid trend explode online in the first place, and it's the part that's actually true, which is exactly why the myth spread as fast as it did. If the coating on that sensor is light carbon soot, and only light carbon soot, from a genuinely temporary rich condition that's already been fixed, sometimes that coating really can burn off on its own during a hard, sustained highway drive, because the sensor tip runs hot enough during real load to combust light surface deposits. That's a real, documented phenomenon. Mechanics have seen it for decades. It's the same basic idea behind why short-trip city driving is harder on your emissions components than consistent highway use. So somewhere along the way, someone took that one real, narrow, specific fact and turned it into a much bigger claim. If heat alone can sometimes clear light soot, then surely adding a chemical additive to the fuel and then driving must clear any clog, permanently, on any sensor, every time. That's the leap. That's where fact turns into folklore. And folklore travels a lot faster than nuance does, especially in a 15-second clip with a dramatic before and after check engine light. So let's talk about what that liquid actually is, because there isn't just one version of this floating around. Some videos use a splash of acetone-based solvent, some use straight lemon juice or apple cider vinegar, poured directly onto a removed sensor and left to soak overnight. One version that's been circulating on car forums for years, and I want you to sit with this one for a second, involves spraying oven cleaner, the kind with lye in it, directly into the sensor bung and letting it sit. The $2 liquid specifically, the one that blew up recently, is a small dose of an off-the-shelf solvent added straight to a full tank of gas before a drive. Different creators, different bottles, same basic promise. Cheap chemicals plus a drive equals a permanently clean sensor. I want to be completely fair here before I tell you why this doesn't hold up. Because the people sharing this aren't lying to you on purpose. Most of them tried it once, their check engine light happened to go off a few days later, and they filmed the win without ever confirming what actually caused it. That's the trap. Your engine computer doesn't clear a code the instant a problem is fixed. It runs what's called a readiness monitor over your next several drive cycles before it reevaluates and either clears the code or keeps it active. So if you pour in a $2 liquid, drive for 20 minutes, and your light goes off 3 days later, it feels like cause and effect. But 3 days and several drive cycles is also exactly enough time for a completely unrelated fix to take hold, like fuel that was already burning cleaner because you happened to fill up with a better quality gas that same week, or a loose connector that reseated itself, and this is the one that actually matters most here, a completely different component that was the real problem the whole time. And that brings me to the reveal that changes how you should be thinking about this entire situation, because this is the part almost nobody talks about. A huge number of the people pouring cheap liquid into their tank to fix an oxygen sensor were never dealing with a clogged oxygen sensor to begin with. They were dealing with a code that looks like an oxygen sensor problem, but is actually being caused by something upstream of it. One diagnostic company that specializes in repair cost data put it plainly. A lazy or underperforming downstream oxygen sensor is very often the real cause behind a P0420 code, the exact code that shows up when a shop tells you your catalytic converter has failed. Confirming the sensor first, before ever touching the converter, can save you from paying for a $1,200 converter replacement you never actually needed. Flip that around, and it means the reverse is also true constantly. A rich condition from a stuck fuel injector, a vacuum leak, a dying spark plug, or a clogged air filter can all make your oxygen sensor look coated and sluggish on a scan tool when the sensor itself is completely healthy and just reporting exactly what it's seeing. Pour a liquid additive into your tank in that situation, and you might genuinely see some improvement, not because you cleaned a clog, but because the additive happened to help clean up combustion just enough to reduce the actual root cause. You get credit for fixing a sensor. What you actually did was mask a different problem that's still sitting there, waiting to come back. Let's talk about the $300 number, because that's the part of this video's title that's doing the most emotional work, and it deserves an honest breakdown instead of outrage. I pulled current repair cost data from multiple independent estimators, and here's what an oxygen sensor job typically actually costs in 2026. Total replacement, parts and labor combined, usually lands somewhere between about $150 and $500, with most mainstream vehicles landing closer to the $200 to $350 range. The part itself, if you're buying a quality aftermarket sensor from a brand like Denso, Bosch, or NTK, the same companies that actually supply sensors to the automakers in the first place, typically runs $75 to $200. Go generic or universal fit, and you might pay as little as $20 to $50. But you're rolling the dice on inconsistent voltage output that can trigger the exact same check engine light right back on, wasting both the part cost and the labor a second time. Labor usually runs somewhere between $80 and $250, and here's what actually drives that number up or down more than anything else: access. An upstream sensor sitting right in the open engine bay might take 30 minutes. A downstream sensor buried behind a heat shield near the firewall, especially on a vehicle where the threads have rusted into the exhaust after years of heat cycling, can take an hour and a half or more, sometimes requiring penetrating oil, direct heat from a torch, and real patience just to break it loose without snapping it off inside the pipe. On top of parts and labor, most shops also charge a diagnostic fee to actually confirm which sensor is bad in the first place, typically $50 to $175, and that fee exists because, as we just talked about, guessing wrong on this specific repair is extremely common. Let me actually put real vehicles against these numbers instead of leaving it abstract, because that's usually where these videos lose you. On an economy car like a Honda Civic or a Toyota Corolla, where the sensors are easy to reach and the parts are cheap, a single sensor replacement typically lands between $160 and $310, averaging out around $230. Step up to something like a Ford F-150 or a Honda Accord, where there's more engine bay to work around and slightly pricier parts, and you're usually looking at somewhere between $190 and $380, averaging closer to $280. Move into a rear bank sensor on a V6 or V8, the kind tucked between the engine and the firewall, where a technician sometimes has to remove other components just to reach it, and labor alone can push the total past $400 even before you factor in the part. European luxury vehicles push it higher still, both because the OEM sensors themselves cost more and because several of them use more complex wideband sensors instead of the simpler narrowband type found on most mainstream cars. So when a video title throws out $300, like it's a universal number, mechanics pulled out of thin air, what it's actually doing is landing almost exactly in the middle of the normal documented range for an ordinary car. That's not a coincidence, and it's not a scam markup either. But here's the number that actually matters more than whether $300 is fair. The part itself, the actual physical sensor, is very often the least expensive component on your entire repair invoice. On most cars, labor and diagnostic time make up the majority of that bill, not the sensor, which means the real leverage point for saving money here was never a $2 bottle of liquid. It's understanding your own vehicle well enough to know what you're actually paying for. Now, let's get into the part of this video that's going to be uncomfortable if you've already tried one of these liquid tricks, because I want to walk you through exactly why cleaning that ceramic element with a solvent doesn't do what people think it does, and why in a lot of cases it actively makes things worse. That zirconia ceramic tip needs a stable, sealed reference chamber of outside air inside the sensor body to make its voltage comparison accurately. That reference chamber has to stay completely clean and completely dry. When people remove a sensor and soak the tip in gasoline, vinegar, lemon juice, or solvent overnight, and I've read through dozens of these accounts on mechanic forums while researching this, the liquid doesn't stay neatly on the outer shroud where the soot actually is. It creeps past the seals into the sensor body. Once solvent gets into that reference chamber, it can permanently ruin the sensor's accuracy because now the chamber isn't reading clean outside air anymore, it's reading contaminated air, and there is no amount of drying or driving that undoes that. One automotive chemical manufacturer, the actual company that makes fuel system cleaning products for a living, states this directly in their own customer guidance. There are no true oxygen sensor cleaners that are safe to run through your engine, and they specifically do not recommend attempting to clean these sensors at all because the function is too critical to risk damaging it or accidentally skewing the air-fuel mixture reading. Think about that for a second. That's not a competitor trying to sell you a replacement sensor talking. That's the company whose entire business is making cleaning chemicals, telling you, in writing, don't do this to this specific part. And this is where I need to tell you about the part of this trend that actually worries me, more than wasted money does. Go read enough of these forum threads and DIY posts about cleaning an oxygen sensor at home, and you'll find people describing soaking the sensor in a jar of gasoline, sealed and agitated, sitting on a workbench overnight. Gasolina, sitting in an open or loosely sealed container indoors, sometimes near a garage with a water heater pilot light or an outlet a few feet away. You'll also find people spraying oven cleaner, the kind with lye in it, directly into the sensor bung and letting it soak, because lye is genuinely good at breaking down carbon deposits. It's also genuinely good at corroding aluminum and eating through the fine threads on a sensor housing, which means a sensor that gets treated this way can come out of that bath more damaged than when it went in, threads ruined, housing pitted, and now, instead of a $300 sensor job, you're looking at a damaged bung that might need a helical repair, or, on a bad day, a section of exhaust pipe replaced entirely. That's not a hypothetical. That's a documented outcome, sitting in real repair forums from real car owners who tried it. And there's a second consequence to this that almost never gets mentioned, because it doesn't show up until weeks later, when nobody's connecting it back to the video they watched. Even when the solvent doesn't damage the reference chamber outright, reinstalling a sensor that's been soaked and handled repeatedly means reusing threads that are now more likely to gall or cross-thread on the way back in, especially on a sensor that was already fighting years of heat cycling before it ever came out. Mark has told me he's pulled sensors that were clearly hand-tightened back and slightly crooked after a home cleaning attempt, and by the time the customer noticed a new exhaust leak or a fresh code, the fix wasn't a sensor anymore. It was a thread repair or a section of pipe, because the bung itself had been damaged in the reinstall. So even in the version of this, where the liquid itself doesn't ruin the sensor, the process of removing and reinstalling a part that was never designed to be serviced this way still carries real risk, and that risk almost never gets mentioned in a 15-second clip that ends on the check engine light turning off. So where does that leave you if your check engine light is on right now and you're staring at a P01130 or a P04420 wondering what to actually do? Here's the honest, verified path, and it's simpler and cheaper than either extreme you've been shown. Step 1. Before you touch the sensor at all, get the actual code read and look at the live data, not just the code number. Any decent scan tool, even a cheap Bluetooth one paired with a free app, will show you the oxygen sensor's voltage switching in real time. A healthy sensor swings quickly and repeatedly between roughly 1/10 of a volt and 9/10 of a volt. A sensor that's genuinely coded or dying will read flat, sluggish, or stuck near one value. If it's switching normally, your sensor is very likely fine, and your code is being caused by something else entirely. A vacuum leak, a dirty mass airflow sensor, a fuel trim issue, and pouring liquid into your tank isn't going to touch any of those. Step 2. If the sensor really is reading flat and the surrounding deposits are described as light carbon soot rather than an oily, green, or gritty residue, address whatever caused that rich condition first, whether that's a fuel injector, a spark plug, or a filter, and then simply drive it normally for a few tank cycles, ideally including some real sustained highway time. That's the one piece of the myth that has real engineering truth behind it. Sustained heat under real load can help a lightly suited sensor read cleaner again without you pouring a single drop of anything into your tank. Step 3. If the deposits are oily, green tinted from antifreeze, or the sensor has simply reached the end of its service life, which for most vehicles lands somewhere between 60,000 and 100,000 miles, stop trying to rescue it and just replace it. Because at that point, you're not looking at a 20-minute drive and $2, you're looking at a part that is genuinely worn out. And here's a detail that saves people from paying twice. If your check engine light is on for a P0420 or P0430 code specifically, the ones that get read as catalytic converter failure, do not let anyone quote you for a converter replacement until the downstream oxygen sensor has actually been confirmed good on live data first. That single check, which takes a technician a few minutes with a scan tool already plugged in, is the difference between a $200 sensor and a $1,200 converter, and it's worth asking for by name before you sign off on anything. And if you do need to replace it, here's the actual money-saving move, the one that's real, verified, and that a $2 bottle of liquid could never touch. If your sensor is reasonably accessible, meaning it's not seized into a heat shield near the firewall with a decade of rust holding it in place, this is one of the easier sensor jobs to do yourself. Buy a quality direct fit sensor from Denso, Bosch, or NTK, the same suppliers that build the original part for most major automakers. Expect to pay somewhere between $75 and $200 depending on your vehicle and whether it's an upstream or downstream sensor. Use an oxygen sensor socket, which is just a deep socket with a slot cut for the wiring harness. Apply a small amount of anti-seize to the threads, avoiding the sensor tip itself, and torque it to spec, which on most vehicles lands around 30 foot-pounds. Do that yourself on an accessible sensor, and you just eliminate the $80 to $250 labor charge entirely, which on most vehicles is close to half of that $300 bill the title mentioned. That's a real, legitimate, several $100 swing in your favor, done with a part that's engineered to actually work, instead of a solvent that the people who make solvents for a living are telling you not to use on this exact component. Now, since we're already talking about cheap chemical tricks that actually do work versus ones that don't, let me give you the one that's real, because I don't want this video to leave you with nothing but a myth debunked and no win in your pocket. There's a sensor on your engine that genuinely does respond well to an inexpensive cleaner. And it's one people confuse with the oxygen sensor constantly because the symptoms overlap almost perfectly. Rough idle, hesitation, reduced fuel economy, a check engine light. It's your mass airflow sensor, sitting in your intake tract measuring incoming air instead of exhaust gas. Unlike the oxygen sensor's sealed ceramic reference chamber, the mass airflow sensor uses an exposed hot wire or hot film element that's specifically designed to be cleaned, and there are purpose-built mass airflow sensor cleaners sold for around $8 to $12 a can, made specifically not to leave residue and not to damage that element the way a generic solvent would. If your symptoms line up and your scan tool shows an oxygen sensor voltage that's actually switching normally, checking and cleaning the mass airflow sensor first, with the correct purpose-built product, costs you about $10 in 15 minutes, and it's one of the few genuinely verified cheap fixes in this entire category. That's the real version of the video you probably expected to get today. It's just attached to a different sensor than the title promised. The process itself takes almost no skill either. You unclip the sensor from the intake tube, usually held by 2 screws, spray it directly with the purpose-built cleaner until it's fully wetted, let it air dry for about 10 minutes without wiping it, since wiping can damage the delicate wire or film element, and clip it back in. No soaking, no overnight wait, no risk to a sealed reference chamber, because there isn't one on this sensor to begin with. It's a genuinely different piece of engineering than the oxygen sensor, which is exactly why one of them tolerates a cheap cleaner and the other one doesn't. Before we wrap this up, I want to give you the actual prevention side of this, because a money-saving video that only tells you what to do after the check engine light is already on is only doing half the job. Oxygen sensors are considered a wear item. They degrade slowly just from constant exposure to hot, corrosive exhaust gas over tens of thousands of miles. And nothing, no liquid, no additive, stops that natural aging process forever, but you can absolutely slow down the contamination side of it. Running a gasoline that meets the top-tier detergency standard, a certification created specifically because the federal minimum requirement for detergent additives was considered too low by a group of automakers, including Toyota, Honda, and General Motors, keeps combustion cleaner in the first place, which means less soot ever reaches that sensor to begin with. Watching your oil consumption matters just as much. If you're adding oil between changes, worn valve seals or piston rings are slowly feeding oil into your exhaust stream, and that's one of the two contamination types that cleaning can never reverse. So catching that early protects the sensor you already have instead of trying to rescue one after the damage is done. And if you ever have gasket or sealant work done near your intake or exhaust, ask specifically for a low volatility, sensor-safe silicone sealant, because generic RTV silicone off the shelf is one of the most common causes of a permanently poisoned sensor, and once that happens, no amount of soaking fixes it, because the silicone bonds directly to the ceramic surface at a chemical level. Let's bring this all the way back around, because here's what I actually want you to walk away with tonight. The $2 liquid trick isn't some evil scam engineered to sell you a bottle of chemicals, and it isn't a genuine engineering breakthrough either. It's a real, narrow fact about heat and light carbon soot that got stretched into a universal miracle claim because a stretched claim gets more views than an honest one. The $300 shop bill isn't a ripoff in most cases either. It's mostly labor and diagnostic time for a job that requires actually confirming which sensor, if any, is genuinely at fault, something a $2 bottle can never do for you. If your light is on right now, don't reach for a solvent and don't immediately reach for your wallet either. Read the code, watch the live voltage data for 30 seconds, and let that tell you whether you're actually looking at a tired sensor or a completely different problem wearing an oxygen sensor's disguise. If it really is the sensor and it's accessible, a $75 part in 20 minutes of your own time will save you more money than any liquid on the market, and it'll actually work. If this saved you from pouring something you shouldn't into your gas tank tonight, or saved you from paying for a part you didn't actually need, tell me in the comments which code sent you looking for this video in the first place. I read every single one of them. Subscribe if you want more of these myths tested against the actual engineering instead of just repeated, because we've got another one of these queued up next, a fuel additive claim that's been circulating even longer than this one. And the real data behind it might surprise you even more than tonight's did. I'll see you in the next one.